What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Just wanted to mention before this video that this is one of the midweek compilation videos that's filled with stories that I believe are new. I've done my best to double check and make sure I haven't read any of them before. If they sound like you've heard them somewhere before, it's possible you've heard them on another narrator's channel. Just wanted to inform you guys that I've decided that these midweek compilation videos will come out on Wednesdays and Fridays. So keep an eye out for those. I also wanted to give people a couple of weeks to adjust to the new schedule, so after this video, instead of a long-winded intro like this, I'll just have a brief intro stating it's a compilation of new stories like usual. I think that's pretty much all I want to mention for now though, guys. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you enjoy your stories. Without further ado. This happened to my parents in the late 1980s. They were in their mid-20s when my parents decided to go camping in California. When they arrived at their destination, it was already kind of late. My mom was sitting down on a log and my dad was unpacking the truck. While sitting down, she heard walking around the campsite, so she quietly told my dad she heard someone out there. They both decided to leave just in case. They drove about 3 miles down the road with their headlights off, so they couldn't be followed. Once they got to the new site, they set up camp and began to drink their asses off while listening to a boxing match on the radio. Eventually, they settled in for the night. Now, they don't know for sure that this next event is connected to the first, but they believe that it is. My dad fell asleep before my mom did. My mom was kinda in that state where you're half awake, half asleep, when suddenly she heard footsteps outside the tent. She abruptly snapped back into consciousness and listened outside. She then tried to wake my dad up quietly, but he was way too out of it for that. She listened for what seemed like hours, when suddenly she heard the creepiest voice you could ever imagine, calling out through the tent walls. "I'm here. I'm gonna kill you." While the man outside was saying this, he ran what she believed to be a knife along the tent wall. She could hear him walking and slowly dragging the knife. She was literally frozen in place. She couldn't say anything or move. She just sat there with her mouth agape. Finally, she snapped out of it though, and screamed for my dad. She told him to grab the shotgun and kill that son of a bitch outside. With that, my dad finally awoke. They heard the snapping of twigs and footsteps, and heard whoever was outside running away. Of course, my parents didn't have a shotgun at all. It was a huge bluff that actually worked in their favor. My dad got up seconds later and began to run outside, but the person was already long gone after he tried to search. After that, my parents decided they were going to get the hell out of there before anything else happened. When they arrived at the truck though, they saw their tires had all been slashed. Now they were in the middle of nowhere, with no way out, with some maniac out there that wanted to kill them. They tried refilling their tires with one of those devices used on blow-up rafts, but obviously that did not work. Still though, they had to try something. About an hour or so later, a ranger that was patrolling the area came along and helped them out. He brought them back into town so they could get their tires fixed. While talking to this ranger, they found out that he had been searching for suspicious activity in the area due to some recent murders nearby. My parents were extremely lucky to make it out of that, because they were most likely the killer's next victims. My sister Sarah often walks at night. She goes outside and walks around random areas of the farm. 2 nights ago, I looked outside and saw her walking at a brisk pace, holding Father's hatchet. It wasn't the first time she'd attacked our cattle at night. We might have sent her away even, if not for this simple truth. She was always asleep whenever she went walking at night. Our father had been gone for 5 years or so, and our mother cried herself to sleep most of the time, cried because of Sarah. It was 1:30 after midnight one night when I awoke suddenly. I knew that Sarah had opened my door. I went over to shut it once again. When I sleep, she often walks around with knives and sharp farm tools in the home. When I walked downstairs, I could see she was there sitting in Father's chair, clutching a knife on her person. She was looking right at me. I took a single step towards her, and she sprung up to her feet and took 2 paces toward me. Then she stopped in place. I called out her name and told her I would take her back to bed now. This time, though, was different. I am not sleeping. I asked her if she wasn't asleep this time, then why was she holding the knife on her? What she said next really scared me. Because I want to kill you and Mother. I told her she was ill and she needed to put the knife back before Mother caught her. She turned around and ran outside. I didn't leave the house that night, and I locked the door behind her. When Mother and I found Sarah the next morning in the moor, she had stabbed herself in the eye and was dead face down outside the barn. I'm worried about my mother now. She hasn't slept well ever since that night. She always has nightmares, and now I don't know what I'm going to do. Driving down Old River Road in California back in 2002, I found myself desperately in need of some gas. I was driving through this old town called Isleton, so I parked my car at the first building I saw. It looked like some kind of old hotel, maybe 150 years old. That's how ancient it looked. I searched all around the town, but I couldn't seem to find a gas station anywhere nearby. What I did see, though, was a very overweight woman sitting on a porch at a nearby house. This house also looked very, very old. I couldn't see the woman's face from where I was, but I could somehow tell she was looking at me the entire time. I looked up at the old hotel windows and saw that someone was also watching me through one of them. If you've ever seen that movie House of Wax, remember the town in that movie? It was almost just like that. I looked over to another building and saw an old rusted metal Coca-Cola sign that was swinging back and forth. It was making this very loud screeching noise. Without any warning, I suddenly felt sick to my stomach. I had no idea why, but I had to throw up right then. I got out of my truck, fell to my knees on the gravel, and vomited all over. I could see to the right of me, someone was approaching me slowly. As soon as I stopped and looked up for a second from my vomiting, I heard the person begin running away. I just barely caught a glimpse of a man ducking behind a building as I looked up. What the hell was going on here? This grown man was sneaking up on me while I was vulnerable. Unfortunately, I soon became sick again. This time, I distinctly saw a woman sneaking around as well. I heard her talking too, and in between my heaving, I heard her say, "Just go do it." I saw the man again begin approaching me faster. I forced myself to my feet and looked at the man as he closed in on me. He stopped in place and looked me dead in the eyes. He was a very skinny man and looked like he was hooked on meth. His eyes were open super wide and his lips were twitching like I'd just caught him in the middle of doing something wrong. All I said to the man was that I was leaving right now. I got in my truck and locked the doors. After that, I looked all around me to make sure I would be clear to leave. The man was already gone and hidden away. I didn't see the woman anymore either. I hit the gas and was out of that town in seconds. It was the creepiest small town I've ever seen, and I don't think I'll ever try to go back there. So, I would consider camping my passion. It's the only hobby I have that I take much interest in. I get really excited to do more, specifically camping alone. Of course, I camp with friends every once in a while, but nothing matches the experience of camping out in the wild all alone. There's just something about sitting beside a fire you made yourself until late at night and going to bed with nothing but the sounds of the wild to accompany you. Of course, camping alone also means I experience some pretty scary-ass shit. Usually, it's just animals howling and crying from the woods that send chills down your spine, or animals that take an interest in your tent. I've had bears sniffing down at me, which was absolutely terrifying. Usually, that keeps me up the rest of the night. I make sure I don't keep any food in my tent though, so no animal should ever really want to go inside. The scariest thing I've had to encounter out in the wild though is another person. You would think that animal and human footprints would sound relatively similar, but I've discovered that they don't really. I've only had it happen twice now. The first time, it was just passing footsteps in the grass while I was out camping. They didn't do anything to me, but knowing someone else was out there and I didn't know who they were scared me shitless. The second time, though, someone stopped and waited for a while. They sounded about 20 feet away from my tent. I was holding my breath until they just walked off again. About a month ago, though, I had the scariest experience of them all. It was around 2 a.m. or so. I had been lying in my sleeping bag for about an hour, listening to the sounds of the wild, when I heard footsteps rapidly approaching me. I remember distinctly how they sounded as they brushed through all the grass. They kept getting closer and closer, and at this point I was pretty freaked out. It sounded like they were approaching me directly. They stopped right outside the entrance of my tent. I was trying my hardest to keep my breathing quiet. I always take a handgun with me when I go camping just to stay safe from animals, and that was the first thing that came to mind when they stopped right there, that I needed that gun as quickly and quietly as I could get it. I reached into my open backpack, ruffling around softly through the clothing and such, until I finally found my gun and pulled it out. I held it tightly, staring at my tent door. What happened next really made me panic. The person outside started to unzip the door. It was so quiet and sneaky, like they were trying to be silent. At this point, I was thinking no more assumptions needed to be made. I was going to make sure I didn't get murdered. I flipped the safety off of my gun. The person stopped unzipping my tent after they heard the click of the safety. I choked out the words, "Who's there? I have a gun." After that, the person ran off faster than I've ever heard anyone run before. Needless to say, I couldn't exactly shut my eyes easily after that. I was shaking. I thought for sure I was either going to be killed or have to kill someone that night. I still do go camping alone. I still go camping alone to this day, despite all the scariness I've experienced. Honestly, the best part about camping is that you never know what you're going to encounter. I'm gonna preface this following story with some relevant information. Some countries have a not exactly common yet still terrifying kidnapping problem. Instead of asking for a ransom though, the perpetrators will murder their victims and harvest them for their organs in order to sell them on the black market. The buyers are typically wealthy, sickly people who would otherwise be unable to find donors. Back in the late 90s, I was around 10 years old, living in Moscow, Russia. One afternoon, I was in my grandmother's room, watching the news on the television. It's not that I was watching the news to stay informed, it's that there was literally nothing else to watch, except some god-awful Soviet-era shows. The news was describing a man the police were after. He was wanted for kidnapping children and harvesting their organs. A composite sketch of the man's face was shown, but I soon grew bored. I telephoned my friend to go outside and play with me. We did, and as the sun was beginning to set, we were walking back on the path home. The path we had taken was quite shadowy, as it was through some trees and between a bunch of condominium buildings. There were hot water pipes running parallel to the path too. Our building was about 60 meters from where the trees finally cleared and the path ended. We were always cautious about our surroundings when we were outside, especially of other people. Because of this, it had become sort of a habit to look behind ourselves every once in a while. Something was making me really uneasy this day though. I looked behind me, expecting to see nothing there, but instead I saw some man was behind us, about 30 meters away. I didn't really put too much stock in it at first. I looked back to the front again. The man's face seemed familiar for some reason. At that exact moment, I remembered that composite sketch from earlier. I was immediately gripped with fear. I glanced behind me again, only to see that to my horror, the man was jogging towards us, quickly closing the gap between us. I turned calmly to my friend, the reason being that if I panicked right now and just told him to run away without any context, he might think I was joking and get caught. Perhaps I also didn't want to arouse the man's suspicion, thinking that if he noticed my intent to run, it would give him enough time to accelerate to a full sprint. Without hesitation, I muttered to my friend that someone was after us, and that on 3, we were going to run as hard as we can to our building. I didn't give him time for a reaction, figuring that if he took it as a joke, he would just think I was trying to get an early advantage in a race game. It was the ideal plan for me. On the count of 3, we sprinted, and never once did I look back. I prepared the keys in advance and hoped I could get the triple doors open in time. The first door we kicked open, as it was the only unlocked one. I unlocked the second door and slammed it shut behind me. I entered the passcode on the next door and stumbled into the building. We immediately began laughing uncomfortably, since it was both so thrilling and so scary. It was much like the times we'd run from a place where we just caused a bunch of mischief, only now with much more danger. That's probably what security thought as well, as the guard didn't believe me when I told him what happened. When I looked back out the windows, I saw no trace of the man. I wondered for a long time if it really could have been the same man from the news, but I guess I'll never find out. The lady that my mother had asked to watch my sisters and I was not well in the head. She would arrive at our flat after dark while my mother was gone and watch us until she returned. She would always insist on playing hide-and-go-seek together. My sisters and I loved this game, but not with the lights off like she would insist every time. This night, it was first my turn to find them. I found my sisters first. They were downstairs hiding together under the table. I was pretty sure the lady was hiding somewhere upstairs. I was too afraid to go look for her though after the last visit. She'd come out of the darkness and grab me out of nowhere. When I screamed, she jammed her fingers down my throat. Me and my sisters waited in the library that night until Mother returned. She was very upset with the lady, as she could not find her either. My mother decided she must have gone home or something, but I was afraid she was still there somewhere. As I was laying in bed, I had just begun to fall asleep, but then I suddenly felt my eyes snap open. I saw the woman coming out from underneath the edge of my bed. As I screamed, she rushed over to me and jammed her fingers down my throat. My eyes poured out tears as she leaned down to look at me. Luckily, my mother just happened to be walking by to go to the bathroom. As she saw what was happening and entered my room, the woman ran away, and I never saw her again after. I don't know the name of the town, but it was somewhere in the last 30 miles or so of Interstate 16. If you've ever been on that road, you know there's maybe 3 exits in the 165 miles that actually have any sort of civilization on them. We were on a road trip, and one of the girls with us had to go to the bathroom really badly. Because of this, we stopped at the next exit. At the end of the off-ramp was a sign that simply said gas 1 mile. We turned that way, and for the entire mile, it was just nothing but trees, with the occasional single-wide trailer off to the side. Then, when we got to the gas station, which looked like something out of a horror movie, the pumps were old and rusty. There were only 2 of them, and the only building was a single gray, tiny building. We walked in there, and the floor sagged as we walked. We walked to the back where the bathroom was. It was only a single-person bathroom, so the girl went first. Then her boyfriend went after. When he went in, though, and came out, all he said was that we needed to leave right away. When we got back to the car, he told us that while he was in there, the entire toilet had suddenly broken through the floor on one side and gotten stuck at a 45-degree angle. The floor was so rotten that he tripped, and at that moment he looked up, only to see that in the window there was a man staring down into his eyes. We got out of there in a real hurry. We're pretty sure that if we had stayed there any longer, we would have had an encounter with some very bad people. Damn it, not again. Those were the words I heard my father saying. He was saying them while looking down at one of our chickens, which had been completely ripped open. Blood was scattered everywhere. This had been the 4th chicken this week to meet such a fate. I was just a boy at the time, but I remember my dad shouting he would gut whatever beast was eating our chickens. My dad unraveled some wire and emptied out some cans of beans, and he wired the cans around the perimeter of the coop. The beasts would come in the night, and when they hit those wired cans, the cans would make a sound. Later that night, after setting up this trap, we heard the sound of the cans clanking and flailing about. Whatever beast this was outside. My dad took a rifle and threw on his boots. He ran out there to face whatever was slaughtering those innocent chickens. I watched from the window as my dad ran out through the field, then stopped dead in his tracks. I ran outside, worried to see what was wrong. It was when I approached and looked at him. His mouth was open, with one lip curled in a face of disgust. I saw that it was no beast at all. Instead, there was a man there. A skin and bones man with long hair and a beard, not wearing any clothes. He was hunched over a chicken, holding the mutilated bird above his head and letting the blood drain down into his mouth. I had never seen something so terrifying in my life. Not even 30 years later have I seen anything like this. My dad lifted the rifle and yelled at the man that he needed to leave right now. I don't know if it was on purpose or because he was so surprised, but my dad fired the gun and nearly hit the man right in the face. The man quickly got up and looked over at my dad with a bloody smile. He then sprinted off. He never did come back, but I always wondered why he was eating those chickens and drinking their blood. Maybe some sort of satanic ritual? Maybe he was mentally ill, or maybe he just liked the taste of blood. I grew up living with my mother and my sister. It was a fairly normal childhood living in a small town in the UK. I never really knew my dad, though. All I knew from what my mother told me was that he was a very bad man. I first met him when I was around 10 years old. It was all very confusing, and I don't really remember everything. I think they had started seeing each other again around that time. They saw each other on and off for a few months. Then he would just disappear for a while. This carried on throughout my teens, up until I was around 15 years old. He started to get quite aggressive around that point, and she would refuse to see him anymore. My mother never told me this when I was younger, but he used to beat her within an inch of his life when she was pregnant with me. One afternoon he came to the door, and when my mom would not let him in, he tried to break the door down, shouting he was going to burn the house down and kill all of us inside. What he didn't know was that I was there to witness all of this. I saw him at the front of the house with his hands to his neck, mimicking slitting our throats. The day he got arrested, my mom got a restraining order against him. That was the last time we had heard from him, until 3 years ago. I got a postcard in the mail with nothing but my name on it and a phone number written down. I instantly recognized my own dad's messy handwriting. I thought it was odd that after 5 years of no contact, I would suddenly get a random postcard from him. Obviously, I ignored it. In July of 2013, though, my mother found the police at our door. They came with some news that was shocking, but also somehow not shocking at all. I'll start from the beginning. My grandmother had gone to visit my father. She's often traveling around, and it wasn't unusual to not hear from her for some weeks. When nobody had heard anything from her for 3 months, though, the family began to worry. The last person who had seen or heard anything from her was my dad. This all happened around the same time I received that postcard. Her going missing had also coincided with the discovery of a body about a half-mile from where she was last seen. A relative identified her from digital reconstruction of her skull, which was a striking resemblance of her. My dad was the #1 suspect at this point. He was arrested on suspicion of her murder and later charged as well. The police took statements and told us they found evidence that proved it was him. My father denied everything, of course. We were all following the case very closely, which was when all the grisly details started coming out. Apparently, they had an argument, and he ended up killing, dismembering, and burying her in a shallow grave. They said she may even have still been alive when he dismembered her. Strangely enough, his family were all on his side and said he was innocent. Later, when he came clean about the whole thing, he said he thought she was a reptile in human skin and wanted to cut her open to see her scales or something. He was being held in a secure psychiatric facility, but currently is in prison. He's been assessed by multiple psychiatrists who say he has paranoid schizophrenia. He was sentenced to 9 years in prison for manslaughter, not murder. I find it absolutely appalling he's served 3 years already, so he'll be out in 6 more. Someone who killed his own mother in cold blood and made death threats to his own daughter will be out of prison so soon. It absolutely terrifies me what could possibly happen if he ever finds me or my family again. I'm also extremely confused about the postcard he sent me at the same time he killed her. I don't understand how the justice system could fuck up so much and let such a dangerous person out of prison so soon. I should also mention he's being held in a different country from where I live, although it's very easy to cross the border. He received an extended sentence that when he's set free, he's not allowed to travel outside the country for a further 9 years. This doesn't mean he would be unable to altogether, though. If he tried, it would only take about 4 hours to get to where I live, from where he is by train. The group of friends I had in my 20s really liked to go to the casino. A lot. They got me into gambling, and the 5 of us all went every weekend for months. To get to the casino, we took this desolate old dirt road. The drive was about an hour from our hometown. One night on the way back, we passed through this incredibly small town that we always drive through. For some reason, though, this time, we thought it would be cool to stop at the bar there and have some drinks in this town. This town was so small. I'm talking 5 buildings maximum, and small old houses tucked behind trees in the back. The open sign was lit up, so we walked into the bar. There was an old man sitting at the end drunk, and a bartender as well. We ordered some beers and sat down at a small metal table in the corner of the room. After some time passed, we'd gotten fairly drunk, and we didn't see any reason to leave either. We kept drinking, and somehow hours later, I found myself walking outside all by myself. I started walking down a dark street with the small houses. I was struggling to stay on my feet. I was so damn drunk I didn't even realize I was all alone. I was in this dark, creepy, unfamiliar town when I came across a guy just standing on his lawn looking at nothing. He was right out of the movies, totally creepy, just standing there. His head snapped up and he began watching me as I passed by. He stopped me for a moment and said something along the lines that I'd had too much. I began talking with this guy. All I can remember of our conversation was him describing to me that he would not kill me because I had an ace hat on, and that sometimes he dreamed of murdering all the town's little girls. He wouldn't though, because Jeff wouldn't think that was right. Whoever Jeff was, even drunk, I knew something was wrong with this guy. He was clearly off his meds. I quickly walked away and explored the incredibly dark town before I accidentally stumbled into the bar again. I don't really remember much more than that. I think the town was called Locke or something if I remember correctly. It gives me chills whenever I think of how easily I could have been killed and nobody would have ever known. In fact, almost nobody in that town seemed to be normal. This encounter happened to my mom when she was in middle school in the early 1970s. Her family lived outside of town, so she had to ride the bus to and from school. She was just getting out of 6th grade and had a boyfriend who also rode her bus with her. They would sit together and hold hands. Nothing inappropriate about their interactions, though. At some point, the bus driver seemed to take notice of their young relationship and started to make comments to them about it. He would often ask if they kissed a lot, if they used their tongues on each other, and even once asked the boy if he sniffed her underwear. Not knowing what to do, they did their best to ignore him. On the last day of school, the bus ride went as usual, except the bus driver skipped my mom's stop. When he stopped at the next house several miles away, she tried to get off the bus with the girl that got off at that stop. The kids all knew each other pretty well and were mostly friends with one another. The driver stopped her and made her sit back down. Every stop after that, when she would try to get off, the bus driver would make her sit back down until finally she was the last one left inside. She was already terrified and crying. She said she couldn't even remember if she was praying out loud or not. She just remembered begging for any idea of how to get away from this evil driver. The driver then told her to move to the front of the bus and sit right behind his seat. Instead, she picked up her things and moved to the very back. On her way, she set her books and things in the middle of the aisle, hoping if he tried to come after her, he would at least be slowed down a bit. He finally started back down her road towards her house, but turned off onto a dirt road leading into some back brush. She finally decided that if he even slowed down enough slightly, she was going to jump out the back emergency door and make a run for it. As he turned down another dirt road, leading deeper into the brush, she happened to glance out the back window and see her dad and older brother in their truck following close behind. She shouted to the driver that he'd better stop the bus right now, because that was her dad right behind them. He stopped the bus and opened the doors for her to get off, but she was too scared to move. Within just a few seconds, her dad was on the bus standing right up next to the driver. She walked around him, and he told her to go get in the truck with her brother. As she sat in the truck, she could see her dad through the back window, just going off on this guy, only verbally, unfortunately. When her dad got back into the truck with her, he hugged her tight, like he never had before. She lost it crying. She knew that if her dad had been scared, she had just escaped with her life. Now, her dad arriving wasn't just a coincidence. Every kid who got off the bus after they missed my mom's stop had gone home and told their parents that the driver wouldn't let her get off and that she was really scared and crying. The parents all called my grandparents to let them know about the stories they were getting from the kids. My grandparents never reported the incident to the police or the school, but they did talk to the owner of the bus company, and they never saw that guy driving again. My mom believes that they didn't report it to the police because her dad threatened to kill the driver, and to turn in a report would get him in trouble. My grandfather went to his grave without ever revealing what he'd actually said on that bus that day. Several years later, my mom was talking with her mother-in-law about Grandma's cousin, who had married a guy from my mom's hometown. She was telling her that this guy was in prison for impregnating his 14-year-old stepdaughter. As an off-the-cuff remark, she mentioned the guy used to be a school bus driver in the district where my mom went to school. My mom almost passed out at this news. I know what you're probably thinking, and I feel the same way. They should have probably said something to the police and had him arrested long before he found another potential victim. I do believe they made a mistake in that regard, but I'm glad he ended up in prison just the same in the end. This happened back in the summer of 2009. I was fresh out of a marriage I had jumped into too quickly, and here I was looking to find myself again. I called two of my oldest siblings that lived in New York City and told them I was coming down for a little visit. Needless to say, they were quite elated. I only had to pay for my bus ticket there, and it was rather cheap as well. I had a good job at the time, so I was able to purchase on a whim. Gleefully, I packed up my suitcase so full I could barely zip it up. It was filled with all my favorite summer clothes, jewelry, makeup, toiletries, etc. I got to the bus station and all was going well so far. The lady at the customer service desk handed over my ticket, and I waited for my bus departure to be announced. Along the way on the bus drive, we made a few stops until we got to our transfer station in Philadelphia. This is where things got a bit weird though. Everyone transferring buses got off, and a new group got on as well. I saw a lot of strange-looking people, but none of them stood out quite like this one guy. He had scraggly brown hair, thick glasses, and a real wild beard. He wasn't bad-smelling though, and didn't look homeless either. In fact, he looked quite well put together and smelled of cologne. There was just something about him though. He had this kind of creepy serial killer lumberjack vibe about him. Whenever I travel, I always take the window seat. It's kind of my thing. Lo and behold, that creepy guy comes and plops down right next to me. He started trying to start up a conversation with me. It was innocent enough though. I'm just not much of a talker by nature. Instead of saying much myself, I just kinda listened while he talked to me about his sister's wedding, stating he had just attended it in Philadelphia and that he was on his way back to New York City. I nodded and smiled. Then he leaned in and did the creepiest whisper I'd ever heard in my life. "I'm going to kiss you now." Before I could do anything or react for that matter, he planted a fat old kiss right on my lips. His scruffy beard scratched my face. I yelped in horror and punched him as hard as I could in his arm. He let out this loud, insane laugh and said that he realized he was in love with me. He knew I was the one. Mind you, I'd never seen this man a second in my life, and I didn't know him from a can of paint. I soon realized this guy must be mentally disturbed. As I stood up to cross over him and go complain to the driver, a young woman appeared a few seats behind us, profusely apologizing and claiming he was her cousin. Apparently, he had a mental disability, and she offered to trade seats with me. I accepted. The whole time, his laughing just got louder and louder, and more disturbing as well. That was the end of my interaction with them, but the next bus stop as I was getting off to get snacks, I walked past their seats. I saw the two of them making out, whispering and laughing. What the fuck? These were strange people to be sure. I don't know if they really were blood-related cousins or not, but I was glad to make it to New York City and see my brother at the station waiting there for me. I ran into his arms, clearly shaken. He asked me what was wrong, but I never told him exactly what happened. Nevertheless, he and my sister still tried to comfort me. I just wouldn't spill the beans, though. I've been a frequent flyer ever since this incident occurred. Even thinking about it gives me the creeps. This happened when I was 9. I left school early because my brother and his friend Sally, who were both 7 at the time, had a dance performance later that day. I was with him and Sally's mom and aunt. I didn't look like I was with them, though. My brother is very dark-skinned, and he could have looked like he was Sally's sibling. On the other hand, I'm very pasty, almost sickly-looking. We would often get stares when I was with them. So there we were, sat on the bus. 9-year-old me was in my school uniform, which was a gray knee-length skirt, a white shirt, and my red jumper that was tied around my waist. I was sitting by myself in a seat, and I had my lunchbox on the seat next to me. I was minding my own business, about halfway through that 30-minute journey to the theater where my brother was performing, when a guy jumped onto the bus. He was the very stereotypical creeper type. Overweight, smelled unclean, baggy, dirty clothes, and scruffy facial hair. He made his way up the stairs and stood over the seat next to me. At the time, I didn't realize there were so many other empty seats he could have sat in, so I moved my lunch bag over, thinking he must have needed this seat. He sat down next to me, touching me, and I could feel his eyes on me. I was uncomfortable, of course, but being the shy kid I was, I didn't say anything. As he sat next to me for a good 10 minutes, his demeanor slowly changed. He began to look around swiftly and moved his hand down towards my leg. That's when Sally's mom, who was in the seat behind him, smacked him over the head with her umbrella. "Hey, stop looking at her legs, you dirty pig." He moved away after. Looking at him, I don't think he'd ever moved that fast in his entire life. The rest of the journey was pretty okay. I was shaken, but pretty relieved Sally's mom had seen what he was about to do. As we got off the bus, though, I looked up at him, and he gave me the most menacing smile. He winked as I hurried off the bus and pretended that had never happened. After that, I saw him on that bus waiting for me every day for the entire next year, until one day he just randomly disappeared. A few years down the line, while searching for a news piece on a local website, I came across the reason why. There was a mugshot of that same exact man, with the same menacing grin. The article explained he'd been caught with child porn and later admitted to the rape of a 5-year-old girl. My dad is a journalist and a non-fiction writer. At the time this happened, he was a reporter for The Virginian, based out of Virginia. He was working on a new book titled The Big Roads when this occurred. We often had to go on road trips for his research needs, and once his proposal for his new book was accepted, we went on a cross-country road trip from Virginia to California and back on Route 66. Me being 13 at the time, I demanded he let me bring along a friend. And so we 3 left on the first quarter of our month-long adventure. It went off without a hitch at first. We either stayed in motels with the occasional stay at a grand old historic hotel, or my dad, being the outdoors man he was, decided we should camp about 5 or 6 times throughout the trip. The first time we camped, we were in the literal middle of nowhere. No one for at least 20 miles on either side, in the middle of the Utah desert. When we arrived at our campsite in our rented minivan, my dad wanted to explore a bit, because at the bottom of the hill that our campsite was situated on was an old Pony Express stop. My friend decided to stay in the minivan, until my dad and I had finished checking out that old Pony Express site. We were utterly alone out there, and as a rather jumpy and skittish 13-year-old girl, it soon became apparent to me that we were isolated to the point that if anything happened, we would be completely screwed. That's all I could think about as my dad and I walked down the hill. We checked out the old station, and everything seemed to be going fairly smoothly until we were about halfway back up the hill. A large truck we'd noticed driving down the old dirt road a few minutes before had turned into the campsite. We were surprised, but didn't really think much of it. Maybe this guy was on an adventure of his own. The truck parked halfway up the road, and a man jumped out. He had what I think was a hunting rifle and started hunting around the area my dad and I were in, about 50 feet from our campsite. Of course, this was an absolute no-hunting zone. My dad had become a bit concerned too, because my friend was alone and quite close to the stranger. He yelled out to the man, saying there were children around and he couldn't hunt there at the moment. As soon as the man turned to face us though, I got an overwhelming sense of complete doom. I felt in my entire body that something was not right with this guy. The man looked us over, and without saying a word, he aimed his gun at us instead. My dad does not carry a gun or a knife or any kind of weapon on his trips. I felt trapped now. My dad ushered me behind a large boulder, but he didn't hide. He stood his ground there. There was a solid minute of this man aiming his gun at my dad, and my dad standing completely still, staring back at him. In my mind, I considered all the ways this could go down. I was absolutely terrified this guy would shoot my dad. Then my friend and I would either have to escape or get murdered too. During this tense minute, the guy lowered his gun, cocked his head to the side, and pointed at my dad using fake gun fingers and fired a fake shot at him. Then he got back in his truck and drove away. That night, my friend and I slept in the minivan in 90-degree heat because I was positive this guy would come back and murder us all. We had a few other creepy incidents that occurred on that trip too, but we ended up just fine and safe after all of it. Two days after graduating high school, my two best friends and I decided to take a camping trip on a mountain that was frequented by locals nearby. Although it's by no means in the middle of nowhere, the town it's located in is a bit smaller than average. It's by no means a bustling metropolis. My friends Brian and Greg were 2 years older than me and had taken the trip to celebrate their graduation. They figured they would introduce me to my college years by doing the same thing they did back then. We packed up all the necessities, tents, chairs, horrible light beer, the whole 9 yards. It was nearing dusk when we began hiking up to the camping area, which was about 4 miles or so from the base of the mountain. We set up camp and shot the shit, exchanging drunken anecdotes while snacking on burnt hot dogs that we attempted to cook in the on-site fire pit. Eventually, we passed out at 2 a.m. Not long after nodding off, though, a noise snapped me out of my sleep. I was still pretty intoxicated, but I could make out what sounded like music coming from just outside the tent. I assumed at first it was Greg or Brian's phone going off and tried to ignore the sound, rolling over. It was at this point, though, that I realized I no longer had my blanket or pillow in the tent with me. In fact, upon opening my eyes fully, I realized this was not the tent we had set up at all. It was just a tarp, which had been fashioned into a makeshift area. My buzz was instantly replaced with full-blown panic as I broke out into a cold sweat. I peered out of this lean and saw what the actual source of the music was. There was a cassette player sitting in the grass about 10 feet away from this tarp I was on, playing what sounded like a homemade recording of a little girl singing. The only other defining feature at this campsite was the clothesline at one end, fixed to a tree, the other on the ground. and there were 3 white dresses hanging down from it, swaying slightly in the breeze. The whole thing was unsettling as fuck, to say the least. I tried to make sense of what was going on here when I heard walking in the forest 50 yards away. I froze, not wanting to believe what was happening to me right now, hoping that when I opened my eyes again, I would be back at the tent with my friends by my side. There was no such luck though. The rustling slowly got closer and closer, and the tape abruptly clicked as it came to an end. The rustling became what sounded like a full-blown sprint and tore off down the mountain. I tore off down the mountain, stumbling a few times and ripping open my knee on the gravelly trail. I didn't even realize it or feel the pain until the next day. I was so full of adrenaline. I don't know how the hell I managed to make it back to the base of the mountain where we had parked. I locked myself in the car and waited until morning. I guess I was so exhausted I managed to fall back asleep because I was awoken by Greg tapping on my driver's side window. He and Brian gave me shit about how I was such a bitch for not being able to stick it out the whole night on the mountain. I just let them rag on me though, because I figured it would be a lot easier than trying to explain the truth of what happened to them. I didn't want to revisit it myself. It wasn't until a couple of weeks later that I dared to ask the question that had been nagging at me. I couldn't help but wonder how they figured I would be back at the car. I asked Brian when we were hanging out and playing video games a couple of nights later. He told me they'd got my note and assumed I'd gotten scared and went back. I asked him what note he was referring to, as I definitely had no recollection of leaving one behind. Brian told me he still had it in his camping bag. After rummaging around a few minutes, he produced a scrap of paper that simply said, "Out walking." I slowly nodded and said I guessed I must have sleep-wrote it or something. He crumpled it up and tossed it into the garbage can. It's been 3 years since that night, and I can't explain the events of that camping trip. I do know one thing though. That note clearly was not in my handwriting. My parents used to live in a different house before I was born. It was a very old house, rather cold and drafty and creaky. One night though, something very strange happened to my mother. My dad had gone out with friends this one evening, leaving my mother home alone. It was around 9:30. My mom is a cop, by the way. As she was relaxing, someone pulled up into the driveway. She saw the lights flashing into the house. Obviously, she found this very strange. It was an early time for my dad to get home. Maybe he'd decided to come home early though for some reason. She became more freaked out though when a light in the laundry room where the back door leads turned on by itself. She swore she could see the outline of someone inside that room from underneath the door. It was at that moment that her cat started hissing and growling. This was very unusual. She wouldn't really hiss at anyone. My mom was beginning to grow incredibly tense. After a minute or so, my mom decided to be brave and open the door to see what was going on here, only to find the room completely empty. The light was still on though. Thing is, the only way to turn on that light was from inside the room itself. She stood there confused, then went to have a look at the car in the driveway. No one had tried to open the door or even knocked since it had arrived. When she went to check, there was no one there though. She didn't think there was any way the car could have gotten out without making a sound. To this day, she still has no idea what that was all about. I used to work as a machine operator for a factory, doing the graveyard shift. It was only me on the floor and a supervisor in the office. For the most part, it was always a two-man shift. Sometimes he would come to help me bring stock materials from the back or something. You see, the back storage room was apparently haunted, or so I was told by the previous shift worker I'd replaced. I'm not superstitious though, and I was extremely skeptical about what he told me. For the first week or so, nothing unnatural happened at all, which of course only reinforced my skepticism. As time went on, however, I started to notice that the machines closest to that storage room entrance would sometimes turn on by themselves randomly. Not to mention, I thought I started to hear people talking in the back storage room while I was passing by. As I mentioned though, it was only me and my supervisor on that shift. When I or he would go to investigate after hearing this, we would only find a dark and silent room. The thing that crowns all these instances though happened a few months later. My supervisor had just finished helping me with a task, and he told me he would be in the office if I needed him. I was carrying on with my work when about 20 minutes later, I heard a colossal crashing noise from the back storage room. Needless to say, it scared the shit out of me. At first, I assumed that must have been him in the back room, and he'd crashed the forklift into the wall or something. When I went to call him though, he was already rushing toward me and demanded to know what that noise was. He had been in his office and assumed it was me as well. I told him I'd been in there the whole time though, and that I thought it was him who had made the noise. We were both confused and mutually agreed to check it out. Just like the previous instances, the back storage lights were all off and it was eerily quiet. When we turned the lights on, we saw a bunch of barrels toppled over and a crate with stock materials thrown all over the ground. These crates were on shelves about 5 feet off the ground, and the barrels were completely full of stock. They were very heavy and were difficult to move. We cleaned this all up and it took us quite a while. He had to use the forklift to put a replacement crate with materials back on the shelf. In the time it took us to fix up the mess, it was now lunch break. He went out to get some food, and I was left alone operating the machines again in this big factory the size of 2 football fields. I wasn't troubled though or scared, knowing he would be back in just half an hour. As the minutes ticked by though, I kept hearing something. It sounded like a woman whispering, and it was coming directly from the dark back room. I tried putting it off, thinking it was all in my head. Then though, I heard something that sounded like a heavy barrel falling down again by itself. I need to clarify as well, these barrels are very heavy. They cannot fall down independently. It requires a great deal of force pushing them over. When I went to investigate, I saw a barrel now in the middle of the room. I booked it out of there after. When my supervisor got back, he asked me what I was doing outside. I told him about the strange whispering and the barrels as well. All this had utterly terrified me. He didn't believe me and thought I was playing a practical joke on him. The security camera, however, verified that this barrel just rolled out by itself from the dark storage area, which defies explanation. Like on the video, you can clearly see me coming into view to check out where that barrel came from and hurry back after turning off the machines. This prompted management to abolish the graveyard shift in that area, and I quit shortly after. I was 10 years old and had just started the 5th grade. I made a new friend in school named Jamie. My parents allowed me to go for a sleepover at her house, even though they'd only met her mother once. My mom and dad were pretty laid back because I was their last child. My sisters were 9 and 13 years older than me. My mom dropped me off and said hello to Jamie's mom. Then she left me there. Jamie and I started playing karaoke when her mom decided she was going to leave. She said goodbye and gave us kisses on the cheek. I remember she smelled a bit like black licorice. Jamie and I were left to do whatever we wanted for the next 5 hours. Jamie's older sister came home around 1 a.m. and told us we should be going to bed soon because we were falling asleep on the couch. We went into Jamie's room and laid down in her bed. Later that night, I can't be sure exactly what time it was. It was pitch black. Jamie's mom came home and I woke up to a pounding on Jamie's door. I started yelling in fear when I felt a hand cover my mouth. It was Jamie telling me to be quiet and pretend to be asleep. At that moment, though, it was too late. Her mother had kicked in the door. She stormed over to the bed and grabbed Jamie's face. She began screaming at her because apparently we'd accidentally left the TV on. I was trying to hide under the covers, but she apparently saw me and began slamming her fists on the bed around me. She screamed at me, "You think you're better than me?" over and over. I was sobbing, and all I could think about was going home. I was so scared, I begged her mom to let me call my parents, telling her I felt sick. Her mom, though, grabbed my chin and looked me in the eyes. "I know what you're doing, little girl, and you aren't going anywhere until I say you can." She stormed out of the room, slamming the half-broken bedroom door behind her. Jamie said nothing, and neither did I. Needless to say, I did not sleep that night. In the morning, when I went to call my mother, Jamie's mother was on the phone. She wouldn't let me use it, even though I asked multiple times. Finally, when she was going to take a shower, I heard her pass the phone over to Jamie's sister and say, "Don't let that bitch use this phone. If you do, I ain't buying you new cigarettes anymore." I was a sheltered kid, and at the time I overheard that, I knew I had to get out of there. I approached Jamie's sister, and she basically threw the phone at me. She was ready to give it to me before I even asked her. With a look of fear in her eyes, she said, "My mom is calling her guy, so you need to go home now." That's exactly what I did. I believe she saved my life to this day. Her mom was calling someone who was going to come and get rid of me. I shudder at the thought. The rest of the story isn't very exciting, though. My mother came to pick me up, and I acted like nothing was wrong. 2 days later, though, it was Parents' Day. Jamie was in my class. Her mother was there as well. Her mother approached me and asked why I never wanted to come over anymore. She accused me of being a mean girl, too. She was talking to me in a way that seemed harmless and therefore wasn't obvious to my mom or teacher. I kept my mouth shut and didn't say a word. 2 weeks later, my oldest sister was babysitting me whilst our parents were at the movies. I broke down and told her everything that happened because I couldn't stop thinking about it. She comforted me and told my parents. We hugged each other and I cried. A couple of weeks later, Jamie stopped coming to school altogether. My classmates wondered what happened, and so did I. I didn't really want to ask my parents, though. 15 years later, I heard from Jamie on Facebook. There was no life-changing conversation, but we did exchange pleasantries. I suppose that's life sometimes. It's so crazy. A few years ago, I got lost in rural Missouri. Like super lost. Backcountry roads lost. I got directions from a gas station where the worker was super pissed that I wouldn't buy his overpriced map. He gave me these directions that included going down this road to this other road to get back to the highway, to get onto the interstate after. So here I am going down this back road when I end up in a small town. It was around 2 p.m., but the town was completely dead. Not a single person anywhere in sight. It was mostly older houses, a run-down downtown area, an old post office, that sort of thing. I was suddenly filled with dread, like Stephen King-type dread. There was trash blowing everywhere in the wind, and there was just nobody around. I drove by the town library, only to see that this area was pretty much abandoned too. There were oversized books in the window, completely swollen from water. I parked my car and got out at one point. I walked up to the glass and looked inside what looked like an old hotel. I tried to open the door, only to find it was locked. Through the glass, I could see there was not one single person inside here either. After that, I decided I had to get the hell out of there. So I made it out of town and kept heading on my way. I made it safely to my destination, and later on I googled the town. What I found was insane. Apparently, the town's history was full of gruesome murders, including one woman murdering another pregnant woman to get the baby, a guy terrorizing the entire town to the point where they all just had to kill him in the street, and various other things. The town was called Skidmore. It's creeped me out more than any other place on the 3 continents I've been to. It was no joke, just absolutely terrifying. This isn't my own encounter, but my mother's experience from when she was around 19 to 21 years old. My mother was almost a victim of a creepy serial killer, who I guess used axes as a signature weapon. She lived alone in a small unit in Richmond, Melbourne, and worked night shifts at a restaurant. Because she worked nights, she would sleep during the day and wake up around 2 to 3 p.m. She had a friend who visited her place regularly around the time she woke up, and they would often eat a meal together and hang out for a couple of hours. This was all part of my mom's daily routine. One day, my mom was at the laundromat alone when she noticed a smallish young European or Middle Eastern macho-looking man unloading a washing machine full of baby clothes. It was not a normal amount either. It was a huge astronomical amount of baby clothes. To my mom, the whole scene looked kind of out of place. The guy didn't seem right in his demeanor either. The man looked over at my mom and stared at her. My mom mentioned she didn't think much about it at the time, as she left shortly after with her load of laundry and drove back to her unit. A couple of weeks later, my mom finished her shift at work and drove back to her place. She went to bed and woke up the next day. In the afternoon, she heard a knock at her front door. Assuming it was her friend, she started walking down the hallway, where you could see a frosted window at the end. She saw a small figure, almost exactly the same size as her friend. She didn't have any thought it could possibly be someone other than who she expected. My mom said, though, that as she was halfway down the hallway, her body suddenly stopped in its tracks, and an immediate overwhelming feeling of crippling fear came over her. She was frozen, staring at the shape of this figure outside for a full minute. That was when an unknown voice called out to her, "Hey, come on, open the door, it's me!" My mom slowly walked back down the hallway into her bedroom. She waited in her room for the unknown visitor to leave, but he would not do so. Every couple of minutes, he would say the exact same thing. "Come on, let me in. I know you're in there. Why don't you just open the door?" According to my mom, she waited in her room for 2 hours, listening to this stranger calling out to her. She couldn't call anyone for help because her phone was in the kitchen, and she didn't have the bravery to leave her room. The unit was tiny and easily accessible. She was afraid the person outside would see her and find a way to get in. She mentioned that after waiting for so long, she couldn't handle the cold temperature of her room anymore, as she was barely wearing anything. She finally mustered the courage to jump up and bolt from her room to the kitchen, which had a back door. She ran out the back door and down the street behind her until she found a neighbor she was friends with. She went straight to their place and explained what happened. They both looked out this person's window, which had a view of my mom's unit. They could still see the stranger standing in front of my mom's door. It was the same man from the laundromat a few weeks earlier. They called the police, obviously, but the man left before anyone came by. After the incident, my mom stayed at her parents' house for a few days. Soon, she felt she was safe to go live on her own unit again. A couple of weeks after moving back in, though, she began receiving notes and letters under her door and on her front steps. According to her, they always had strange things written in them, but she would never tell me exactly what it was. She did mention that the sentences and words were extremely amateur, as if written by a 6-year-old or something. The letters were all squiggly and written back to front, arranged in strange sequences. My mom would give the notes to the police station. They weren't treated as much of a threat, though. This continued for a few weeks to a month, until one day my mom woke up in the afternoon after a previous night shift like any other day. She felt she needed to go and spend a night at her parents' house that night though. She left and spent the night there. She got a call the next day, only to find the strange man from the first incident had returned to her unit around the same time she'd left. He'd made his way to the back of her unit with an axe in hand and immediately started axing down her back door like a madman. He was seen by a neighbor who called the police. However, the man left before the police arrived. It turned out in the end that the man's description, partnered with the strange notes my mom was receiving, fit the policeman's belief that the man was a suspect of the rape and murder of a number of girls in Melbourne from the 70s onward. From what I know, he was not caught. I don't know if he ever was, so he might even still be out there to this day. So before I begin, perhaps a bit of background information would help you better understand my story. I'm now a 20-year-old male living in the Netherlands. I've been a geek all my life. Games in particular have played a major role in my life. That's starting with when I got my first PlayStation. When I was around 5 years old, something about gaming just always got to me. Be it mechanics or terms of storytelling, I could always find something to love about it. As I grew older, I got more and more into RPGs, and eventually found myself on World of Warcraft. As I got more involved in the game, I started joining raiding guilds. For those of you who don't know, it's basically a group of players who intend on facing the game's hardest content as a team. The second guild I joined was the greatest team of people I had met thus far. One of these people was a Swedish girl who was around my age named Maggie. We got along quite nicely as it turned out. Her mom was also in this guild too, and was actually living in the Netherlands, so we would often end up in conversations where she asked me to teach her some Dutch, and she would teach me some Swedish in return. It was all in good fun. Fast forward to the beginning of 2013. The aforementioned guild had since fallen apart a while back, and I had joined a new one. I stayed in touch with some people in the old guild, but Maggie hadn't really been online all that much. When she did get back online, we quickly caught up. It turned out she'd actually moved in with her mother and spent the last couple of months improving her Dutch and attending high school. She'd also started dating a guy named William, who was actually part of the same guild. I had met him before, and he always struck me as a nice guy. Other guild members always thought he was a bit direct and perhaps a bit rude as well. But being Dutch, I understood that's simply how our culture works. I was always okay with it. June comes around, and me and Maggie recently finished our final exams, and we're waiting for the results to come back in. One afternoon, while we were playing online, I suggested a meetup between the two of us. I didn't really have much to do, and given that she had voiced her concerns about finding her footing in Dutch social circles, I figured this would be a nice opportunity to take her first baby steps into the country. She excitedly agreed, and asked if she could bring William along as well. Obviously, I said yes, seeing as he was her boyfriend and all. Meetups are much safer when you arrive as a couple, and meeting former guild members was something I looked forward to anyway. A couple days later, I met them both in Rotterdam, and we had a great day together. I showed them both around the city since I knew it best. We had some nice conversations and a few laughs, and we ended the day by taking a trip to the Euromast. Before leaving, Maggie had to use the restroom, so me and William were waiting outside striking some conversation. I told him that the two of them looked like they made a nice couple. Thanks, I freaking love her. You know, honestly, I don't know what I'd do without her. At this stage, back then, I didn't think much of that statement. It's just a thing people say when they're in love. So kudos to him, right? Maggie came out of the restroom and we said our goodbyes and parted ways. A few weeks later, we got our exam scores back. I passed high school with flying colors, but Maggie wasn't so lucky. She had failed most of her exams. She told me she was going to be studying for the rest of the summer. In order to properly prepare herself for the rerun of the last year of high school, I told her if she needed any help, I was willing to see what I could do. She was very thankful and assured me she would let me know if anything happened. Fast forward again to September. After our last conversation, Maggie had practically disappeared off the internet altogether. She hadn't logged in to WoW, she was never on Skype, she wasn't even on Facebook. I asked William in mid-August how she was doing, and he assured me she was fine. I thought nothing of it. I even admired her focus on her education. My second week in college, though, that all changed. I got into the metro and picked up a free newspaper in the seat next to me to pass the time. I vividly remember turning the fourth page to read the headline, "Swedish woman 19 from city, stabbed in own backyard." It took me a few seconds to even realize she lived in the city now and that she was 19 years old. Even though the article didn't mention her name, I grew very concerned. I sent her a text message as we had exchanged phone numbers back when we met up. I asked her if she was okay. The rest of the day went by and I heard nothing from Maggie. I figured that if something did happen to her, people would have most likely started posting things on her Facebook. I started typing her name in the search bar. Sure enough, it was already full of messages from people who'd heard she passed away from her injuries. After inquiring with some other people, it turned out William had stabbed her to death. She'd broken up with him after her horrendous test results to focus on studying, and he wasn't all too pleased with that. In the aftermath of the incident, me and some other Dutch guild members went to her city to meet up with her friends from school. We attended the memorial setup and put flowers at the scene of the crime. We also found out that William hadn't been half as nice as we thought he was. During the relationship, he had been very controlling of Maggie, and after the breakup, he began stalking her relentlessly, sending her threatening text messages. She even went to the police to report it, but they told her they couldn't do anything about it. After that, she met a different guy and started dating him. William found out and took matters into his own hands. Thinking back on this, the worst part of it just came to mind. When we put flowers at the scene of the crime, we stood around for a few minutes, contemplating whether or not we should go up to the front door and personally give her mother our condolences. She was our friend as well. We decided against it though, given we might unintentionally remind her about Maggie's online connections, which ultimately cost her her life. When we got back to our car, we saw Maggie's front door open, and out the door came her mother and Maggie's younger sister. I knew she had a younger sister, but what I didn't know was she was only 6 years old. I lost it and began sobbing when I saw her little head hanging down while grabbing hold of her mother, too scared to go around the corner and face everything people had left behind for her sister. I found a very recent article that stated William will most likely be spending 20 years in prison. Honestly though, I hope he never makes it out of there. This story is 100% real. It's about an experience I had going on the deep web. For those of you who don't know, the deep web is pretty much the hidden internet. It isn't indexed by search engines, and you need special software to access it. It's several thousand times bigger than the surface web, which can be reached by Google or Yahoo, etc. It's also home to some illegal things. You can buy stolen guns, any drug you can imagine, stolen phones. They even say you can hire hitmen on there, though I'm not sure I believe that. Any illegal thing you can imagine, maybe you can find it on there. I never had a great childhood. My dad was gone all the time, and my mom was too. Whenever she was home, there was normally verbal and physical abuse. I always needed to have a way to escape it all, whether it was playing video games, watching movies, or even resorting to drinking. One day, I was invited over to a friend's house for a sleepover. When I got there, he immediately told me he had something to show me. We went upstairs and he showed me his laptop. He said he'd got on to the deep web. We stayed up late that night, browsing through all sorts of interesting things on it. He showed me how to use it, and I took some notes. The next day, I decided to try it out for myself. I downloaded all the software I needed, and I was good to go. I went on the deep web. There was a page of links in order to go to different sites. As you keep clicking on these links, other new links will pop up. At first, I only found a bunch of boring websites or tons of dead ones as well. Even disgusting ones filled with videos of people dying in accidents and stuff. Eventually, I found a forum. I can't remember what it was about, but I asked how to get to any interesting sites that were not illegal. One guy sent me a link. He said it was a site that contained leaked government documents. I thought that was pretty interesting, so I clicked on it. When I pulled up the page, I was pretty shocked to see a bunch of videos of people apparently being tortured, raped, and murdered in the most horrible of ways. I have a pretty strong stomach, so I was ready to ignore it and just exit. That was when I realized that all the videos were playing at once. When I moved over the browser, there was no bar that let you pause or stop it. That's when it hit me that these were apparently live streams. I clicked on one that said, "Homeless man kidnapped in my basement." In it, a man was tied to a chair covered in blood. To his left was a table, and on it was a whole bunch of tools. There was a hooded man standing by it. On the right of the live stream, there was a chat box, and people were requesting the hooded man do various things, like cut off the homeless man's fingers or rip out his hair. Eventually, one man in the chat box said he would pay several Bitcoin for the guy to gouge out the homeless man's eyes. The hooded man agreed and grabbed what looked like a fork off the table. I quickly closed the live stream. I tried to leave the site, but I found my computer was frozen. I could only hear the sounds of a stream going in the background. A few seconds later, the sound stopped, and a chat box appeared in the center of my screen. I couldn't exit it out. Somebody in the box typed in, "Hello, how did you like my site?" I paused for a moment, not sure if this was some sort of automated message. Then they typed again, "Are you going to answer or what?" I stayed frozen in place, but eventually typed in, "Who is this?" The guy explained that he was apparently the owner of the site, and he liked to greet first-time users personally. I got a disgusted look on my face, and this is where things got really scary. In the chat box, the man typed, "It's rude to make faces, you know." My eyes got wide. I noticed my webcam was turned on when I always keep it off. I covered the webcam with a sticky note. I typed that I was calling the police. There was a brief pause, and then, horrifyingly, a bunch of data was posted in the box. I looked at it and realized it was everything about me. My full name, email address, my age. It even had my parents' info as well. I panicked and shut off my computer. I hoped that would be the end of it. I did a complete wipe of my computer's data and went to get a drink. I was under a lot of stress that night. My mom said she wouldn't be home. She didn't say where she'd be at, but at this point in my life, I didn't really care. My dad, of course, was nowhere to be seen either. I couldn't sleep, so I stayed up watching a movie. I ended up falling asleep on the couch. I don't know why, but at around 2:30 in the morning, I woke up. The TV was still on and was giving off a dim light. When I opened my eyes a little more, I almost screamed. There was a person standing a few feet away from me with a mask on. I flew off the couch and darted for the door. I heard footsteps coming after me. I ran outside screaming as loud as I could, trying to get someone's attention. I looked behind me and saw the man was running. He was faster than me. I screamed louder and noticed I had tears running down my face. I was pushed down to the ground with such force that I felt blood in my mouth. I heard a car speed up beside me. I was being dragged to it by the sound of it. They were going to take me away. Maybe I was going to go on that website I found earlier. I had almost accepted my fate when the man with the mask screamed in pain. I looked over and saw the van they were in speeding away. My neighbor was hitting the masked man who had been left behind with a baseball bat. The police arrived and took the masked man in. Eventually, they caught the van as well. I moved out after that, and I'll never go on the deep web ever again. It was the summer before my senior year in college. My little brother, who's always been interested in military stuff, had gotten a pair of night vision goggles for his birthday. He left them at my apartment one night. I was so bored I decided to try out those goggles at a wooded hiking area / nature preserve nearby. In retrospect, it seems like a pretty stupid idea, since I was all by myself and a female, but I was young and stupid. I got myself all worked up at the prospect of possibly seeing a deer or other woodland critters in their natural nighttime habitat. I was very familiar with these woods. My best friend and I had hiked there at night before, and we had never run into anyone else. Our area is pretty rural and pretty safe as well, so I didn't anticipate any trouble. I parked in the sparsely lit parking area and ignored the sign that said the park closed at 10 p.m. I entered the woods, night vision goggles in hand. It was a half moon that night, and that was the only light that filtered down through the canopy of trees. It was pretty damn dark, and I didn't want to put on the goggles until I found a place to sit down. I lit my way with the mini mag light on my keychain. A couple of times I thought I'd heard rustling in the woods, a fair distance away from me, but it was nothing out of the ordinary. I put it down to animal activity. Hopefully it was the very same deer I'd been hoping to see coming out here. I hiked a fair distance and found a fallen log to sit down on. I put the goggles on. I don't know if you've ever used night vision goggles before, but the effect is very impressive. They can turn pitch black darkness into something you can see in. Sure, everything appears in shades of green, but it's quite bright and clear. For a while I had a blast, just looking around from my fallen log vantage point. Some chipmunks played around in the leaves nearby, and a big owl blinked its lamp-like eyes at me from a tree branch. There were no deer around though. I started to think that maybe they wouldn't be likely to come anywhere near me, darkness or not, especially if I continued to sit right out in the open on a log, so I decided to find a place I could be a little bit more hidden. I made my way a little deeper into the woods and found a huge tree perfect for climbing. I've always loved climbing trees, so it was nothing for me to hoist myself up a few branches and settle in to wait for the animals. I didn't get to see any though. What I did see lit up in bright night vision green after about 10 minutes of waiting was a man dressed head to toe in dark clothing, making his way stealthily through the trees. He was coming from the same direction I'd just come from and was clearly trying to stay hidden, moving from tree to tree and glancing around before carefully moving again. It looked very much like he was looking for someone. It took me a few moments to notice he was carrying something, and when I saw what it was, the back of the hairs on my neck stood on end. He had a knife in hand, a big one too. He was gripping it as if he expected to use it in the very near future. It wasn't deer hunting season, and this was a nature preserve where hunting of any kind is prohibited. At any rate, this guy was alone and not dressed like a hunter either. I was suddenly aware of my horrifying situation. A young woman, alone and weaponless in the middle of the woods at night. This was the 1990s, so no cell phones either. Even if I did have one, I wouldn't have felt safe using it, lest I draw his attention. I didn't know how he was able to see so well in the dark. I guess his eyes had adjusted. I was terrified he would look up and see me there. I sat there, afraid to move or even breathe, and watched him as he continued his methodical and stealthy process of scanning the forest for whoever the hell he was stalking. I scanned around but couldn't see anyone else, even from my high vantage point. I had the sickening thought that maybe he was looking for me. I remembered the rustling noises I'd heard in the woods when I first arrived. Then I thought back further and remembered something else. A white car that had followed me too close behind for most of my drive to the nature preserve. I'd been a little annoyed and freaked out at the time, but when I turned into the nature preserve parking lot, the car had passed me by and drove on its own way, so I hadn't thought anything more of it. Now I wondered if this was the driver of that car and he'd circled back and seen my car parked alone in the lot. I sat paralyzed in fear and watched the man for what felt like forever, but was probably about half an hour or so. There was a heart-stopping moment when he paused right underneath my tree. I was sure he was going to look up and find me, but he never did. After a while, he seemed to have given up on whatever plan he had in mind. I heard him say, "Man, fuck it." He started heading back in the direction he came from, the direction of the parking area. I stayed in the tree, with sweat and tears running down my face, until the sun came up a few hours later. I climbed down still terrified, gripping the little can of pepper spray on my keychain. I made my way as fast as I could to the parking lot. Clearly, the man had been there. My windshield had been smashed with a rock, and someone had scraped all down the sides of the car with something sharp, presumably that giant knife. I'm just lucky I didn't end up with it sticking out of my chest. Thank God for night vision goggles that let me see him before he could see me. Thank God for big trees with sturdy branches